was a cold and misty morning when Albert Westbrook stepped off the bus at the city's main train station. His hands were cold, his coat thin, and the old letter he gripped tightly in his palm was slightly crumpled, a testimony to how many times it had been folded and unfolded. This was no ordinary letter. It was the first he had received in over 20 years from his estranged son, Nicholas. The letter had arrived unexpectedly, yellowed with age, and showing signs of being misplaced in the postal system. There was no date, no explanation for the delay, just simple words. "I want to see you. Dad, meet me at the station. I'll be waiting." Albert's heart raced as he walked into the station, his pace slow but steady, like a man with a purpose. He didn't care how long he had to wait. This moment had been so long in the making, and he was determined to see it through. The train station was bustling with activity, people hurrying in all directions, some pulling large rolling suitcases, while others carried their luggage with little more than a tired expression. Announcements echoed in the background, and the clicking of train wheels filled the air, but none of it registered to Albert. His mind was elsewhere on the son he had not seen since Nicholas was just a boy of 12. His legs were heavy, but his heart was light with hope. He found a seat on a bench tucked away in the corner, folding the letter and placing it inside his coat pocket. He sat, his eyes constantly scanning the sea of people, hoping for a familiar face to appear he had waited for this moment for so long. And now, as the minutes turned into hours, the station's constant noise and bustle faded into the background of his mind. Every time a tall figure walked by, Albert's heart skipped a beat, only for the hope to dim when it turned out not to be his son. His body grew tired, but his resolve never faltered. He would wait. It was around noon when Albert first noticed the station security guard, a man named David Lawson, who had begun to circle the area where Albert sat. David was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a stiff uniform, his expression stern. He didn't seem to mind the crowds or the noise. He was a man on duty, and that was all he focused on. David had been patrolling the station for years, overseeing the regular flow of people, making sure nothing was out of place, and helping the occasional lost traveler. But as soon as he spotted Albert sitting alone, he knew he had to investigate. People like Albert, who weren't buying tickets or catching trains, tended to make the station look bad. David approached Albert, his boots clicking sharply against the floor as he walked over to the bench. He stopped in of Albert, arms crossed. "How long have you been sitting here?" David asked, his voice gruff and commanding. Albert looked up, surprised by the confrontation, but remained calm. "I'm waiting for someone," Albert replied, his voice steady. David raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Waiting for a train?" "No." Albert shook his head. "I'm waiting for my son. He's supposed to meet me here." The guard's face hardened. "This isn't a place to just sit around. If you're not catching a train or buying a ticket, you can't stay here. We've got rules." Albert reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the letter, holding it out to David. "I have a letter from him. He asked me to meet him here." David didn't even glance at the letter. He barely even acknowledged it before responding. "You can't sit here all day. You understand? We've got rules around here. If you're not causing trouble, I'll let you stay, but don't make a habit of this." Albert's grip tightened on the letter, but he said nothing. He didn't want to cause trouble. He simply nodded and quietly replied, "I won't leave." He's coming with a sigh. David turned on his heel and walked away, shaking his head. Albert sat in silence, the weight of David's words hanging heavy in the air. He was a stranger to David, but to Albert this was the most important moment of his life. He would wait as long as it took. The day wore on. The station's lively hum of activity didn't change, but Albert felt himself growing heavier with each passing hour. He stood and stretched, his legs sore, his body stiff from the hours of sitting. He walked slowly to the entrance of the station, scanning the crowds but saw no sign of his son. He returned to the bench, clutching the letter like a lifeline. As the hours passed, Albert's hope began to waver, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. This was all he had left. It wasn't long before David passed by again. giving him a look of disdain. He didn't stop this time, but Albert knew the guard was still watching him, waiting for any excuse to send him away. Even as night began to fall, Albert remained seated. The crowd thudded and the noise grew quieter, but Albert never looked away from the door. His son could still come through at any moment. The next morning, Albert had barely slept. He'd spent another cold night at the station, but he wasn't ready to leave. The sun's first rays came through the glass windows of the station, casting a soft light on the warm floor. As Albert sat rubbing his stiff legs and reading the letter again, David appeared once more, now visibly more wary of Albert's continued presence. The man walked toward Albert, his expression still here. "Huh." David's voice was softer now, not quite as harsh as the previous day. "I'm still waiting," Albert answered, his voice calm despite his exhaustion. David hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the letter Albert still clutched in his hands. "You really think he's coming?" David asked, his tone shifting, curiosity creeping into his words. Albert's eyes never left the door. "I know he is." David studied Albert for a long moment, and then sat down next to him on the bench. For the first time, he didn't look at Albert with suspicion. He looked at him with something resembling understanding. Albert spoke softly, the words tumbling out. He told David the story of his son, how he had lost everything, his job, his home, and eventually his son, how he had pushed Nicholas away, thinking it was for the best, and how, now, he was waiting for the chance to make things right. David listened, his arms crossed but not in judgment for the first time in their interactions. He wasn't trying to remove Albert from the station. Instead, he seemed to be taking in Albert's words. "Maybe you're right," David said after a long pause. "Maybe your son's coming, but you can't stay here forever. People are starting to notice." Albert looked at him with quiet resolve. "I can't leave. Not now." The next day, as David was patrolling again, he looked over at Albert, sitting there with the letter in hand. Something stirred in David, a sense of guilt, perhaps, for how he had judged Albert in the beginning. He didn't know what made him act on it, but he bought coffee and a sandwich from the vending machine and brought them over to Albert. "You look like you could use this," David said, offering the food. Albert hesitated but took the sandwich, his hands shaking slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the station surrounding them. Albert pulled the letter from his coat, tracing the faded words with his fingers. David asked quietly, "Mind if I read it?" Albert handed the letter over, and David read it slowly, his frown deepening as he looked at the postmark. "This letter's old," David said. "It looks like it's been sitting around for years." Albert nodded slowly. "It just came a few days ago." David frowned, clearly conflicted. "Your son might not even know you got this." Albert's heart sank. The idea had never crossed his mind. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He had believed in the letter so deeply. But now, doubts crept in. But David didn't let it go. He went to the security office, began searching for any trace of Albert's son, Nicholas. He combed through records, finding mentions of a young man who had searched for his father. The trail had gone cold years ago. When David returned with the information, Albert's heart raced. "He's been looking for you." "Albert, he didn't give up." Albert looked at the paper, his eyes brimming with emotion. "He never gave up." David nodded. "Looks like you weren't the only one waiting." After several more days of searching, Albert and David finally arrived at an old neighborhood. The woman who answered the door recognized Albert's name immediately. She smiled sadly as she spoke of Nicholas. "He's alive," she said softly. "He's been waiting for you." They drove to the hospital. When they entered the room, Albert froze as he saw his son, pale and weak from surgery, but unmistakably his son. "Dad," Nicholas whispered, his voice barely audible. Albert fell into the chair beside him, tears streaming down his face. "I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm glad you came." Nicholas whispered, squeezing his father's hand. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. As the days passed, Albert and Nicholas began to heal their fractured relationship. Albert's heart was heavy with guilt, but he was determined to make up for lost time, and for the first time in years, Albert had something. He had almost given up hope on a chance to rebuild the connection with his son. And as for David, he had seen a man's life shift before his eyes. He realized that sometimes the hardest stories were the ones worth helping.